for coming. I have a little, it's probably the 20th of these talks that I've given. And, you know, to show you the kind of diversity of Jewish experience in this country, I've been in rooms where there are 500 people and all of them sort of knew Edmond Safra personally. And I've been in rooms of 100, 200 people where they had no idea who he was.
Harry, can we make it louder? We need a little bit louder.
Okay, I can speak a little louder. So I have a bit of routine. How many people here, you know, knew who Edmond Safra was? They're familiar with the name. Okay. How many people here met him personally? Okay. Anybody? Okay, we have two. Anybody who worked at one of his banks or had an account at one of his banks? Okay. And then I go down the list. Anybody who was, you know, in school with him in Beirut in the 1940s? Okay. As I said, I've been in rooms where everybody raises their hands and rooms where nobody raises their hands. And I sort of had a sense from coming here that there would probably be a greater sort of knowledge of who he was, because he was really one of the most important Sephardic Jews of the second half of the 20th century. When I started writing this book, I showed the first chapter to my wife and she said, you know, you were born to write this project. And in some ways, maybe I was. On a professional level, as Bernard so kindly repeated, I spent the last 30 years as a business journalist. I studied business and economic history as an undergrad and graduate student. Been a columnist for the New York Times. I covered the financial crisis, written a bunch of books. I've interviewed and met pretty much every major figure in finance, from Warren Buffett to Alan Greenspan. And that's a qualification that would let you construct the story of someone who has had a remarkable banking career. Startups, sold his two main banks for $10 billion. He was a key figure in financial globalization. A banker is what he was. As for who he was, that's a little bit more complicated question. He was a Syrian Jew, even though he was born in Beirut, was a citizen of Brazil, was a resident of Monaco and Switzerland, and had homes in 7 different countries. A Syrian Jew, and in particular a Jew from Aleppo or Halab, is who he was. And that is what got me in the door and helped me make sense of what I found. My last name is Gross. My father is a nice Ashkenazic Jewish boy from the Bronx, but he was an only child, and his parents died when he was about 20, long before I was born. The only family I had growing up was my mother's family, and her name was Sandra Nasser. My grandfather was a man named Leon Nasser, and he had 8 brothers and sisters. My grandmother was Frida Dweck from a family of, I think, 10. My cousin Lila is here. We share the same grandparents. And while we grew up in Michigan, this was our family. They were Syrian Jews from Brooklyn and Deal. We were not Goldbergs and Schwartzes. We had names like Nasser and Dweck and Sit and Towel. They didn't talk or curse or give terms of endearments in Yiddish. They did it in Arabic. I had a sittah, not a bubby. We ate hummus and kibbeh, not matzo ball soup and brisket. When something bad happened, people didn't say oy vey. What would they say? Ya haram. And when something good happened, instead of saying mazel tov, we would say mabruk. So if you constructed a Venn diagram of people who can write beautiful, sweeping narratives about 20th century global finance, and people whose great-grandparents were born in Aleppo, it's a very small overlap, and the overlap is a 15-year-old publicity photo of a much younger and thinner me. This was the thing. Edmond Safra was a very private person. He had a remarkable career. He was born in 1932 into a banking family in Beirut. At the age of 15, he was sent to Milan and started trading gold. In his early 20s, he moved the family to Brazil and set up trading operations. In the late 1950s, he started a bank in Geneva, a trade development bank, a classic Swiss private bank. In 1964, he came to New York and started Republic Bank as a startup. It grew into the 11th largest bank in the United States. The stocks of his banks, which were public, had a compounded 25% annual return over a period of nearly 30 years. He became a billionaire. He lived in some of the best real estate around the world. And along the way, he was the protector and often the savior of the Jewish communities of Beirut and Aleppo, offering people jobs, moral support, financial support, using his connections, building synagogues wherever they were forming communities. For this community, I write, he was a Rothschild, a Buffett, and a Schindler all rolled into one. Now, a great many things happened in his life. There was this crazy episode in 1988 when American Express ran the smear campaign against him. That is documented in a 500-page book by a guy named Brian Burrow, who's one of the great business journalists of our day. He died in a suspicious fire in 1999 in Monaco. That was written up by Dominic Dunn in Vanity Fair. So a lot of people know about him is how he was attacked and how he died, but very few people know how he lived. What was missing was that story. And to understand that story, you had to understand certain things. The Safra Foundation has this remarkable archive of family papers, business documents, letters going back 50, 60, 70 years in Hebrew, Arabic, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, German, and French. They had also conducted interviews with hundreds of people who knew him, people who were his classmates in Beirut, Henry Kravis, central bankers, Rothschilds. This document is a promissory note that was signed by Jacob Safra, who's Edmond's father, you can see it. It was signed in Beirut. And so it's kind of written in French, but it's also written in Arabic that tell you the details of it. I know Hebrew, I can read Arabic, and I can muddle through all these other languages with the help of Google. And it was like dumping out a jigsaw puzzle that had 2,000 pieces. You can put it together if you know how the pieces interconnect with each other. And it's possible to tell the financial story of his businesses. His banks were publicly held. You could look at their 10Ks, their 10Qs, and understand how they grew. But there was a lot of code, and that if you didn't know how to read the code, you would miss all the details. This usually doesn't happen until after like 5 or 6 minutes. You had to understand why gold traded freely in Hong Kong and India in the 1940s, but not in Europe. You had to understand what it meant when you called someone a hamor in Arabic or a sharmuta. I can tell some of you know what that means. My grandparents were very proud of their heritage and of the Syrian community. Our great grandmother, Becky, who was born in Aleppo, was someone who we knew. She was born in Aleppo around the same time as Edmond Safra's father. And when I read all these interviews with people, I could hear them in that voice, in that accent. As I said, Edmond Safra was a private man. There was almost impossible to find video of him. He didn't appear on CNBC. He didn't give interviews. But the story was there. And so when I got a phone call in 2017 from a colleague who said, "Do you know who Edmond Safra is?" I said, "Yes, of course I do." I told him about my background, and the next thing, I'm on a plane to London to meet with his widow, Lily Safra. Now, Lily Safra died last summer at the age of 87. She was a formidable woman in her own right. When she and Edmond met in the late 1960s, she was wealthier than he was. And she had an eye for fine art, real estate, and really opened up his world. She's another person about whom there are a lot of myths and conspiracy theories and fiction. But she spent the last 23 years of her life after his death running his foundation, supporting synagogues, schools, education, medical research all over the world. And she told me that there had been some prior attempts to try to piece the story together. But they were by business writers who got a lot of it, but they didn't get the essence. They couldn't understand why it was that when the family shipped all their possessions to Brazil in the 1950s, when you look on the packing list, it says 1 kilogram zatar. They didn't understand how come his license plates and phone numbers always ended in 5555. They didn't understand why he did deals on a Tuesday. Who can tell me why you might do deals on a Tuesday? Pamaim Kitov. Because in Genesis, in that section where it talks about the third day, it says that Hashem saw that it was good twice. So Tuesday is seen as an auspicious day. Why was it that even as he built a multi-billion-dollar banking empire, he insisted on owning and operating his father's tiny bank in Beirut, Banque de Crédit National, that he still owned it at his death in 1999? And why, when he had a groundbreaking for his skyscraper in the city in New York in the 80s, there was not one, but 2 rabbis present? Understanding these motivations and details and hundreds of more that led me to put this story together. So I'm going to take you briefly on a part of the journey that he underwent, and it starts in Aleppo. Are there any Halabis here? Raise your hand high if you're a Halabi. Okay.
Everyone here. You want a little louder?
Okay, I'll talk louder. Halabis are people from Aleppo. It's where our great-grandparents came from. It's one of the oldest and most interesting Jewish communities around. It was in the Bible as Aram Sova, conquered by King David's armies. The Great Synagogue, which is pictured here, which now unfortunately lies in ruins, has a cornerstone that dates to the 3rd century CE. The community's greatest possession was the Aleppo Codex. This was a Bible, a full text of a Bible in the form of a book that came from Egypt in the 14th century and is one of the oldest and most authoritative Bibles written down that we have. In the Ottoman Empire, Aleppo was the 3rd largest city in the Ottoman Empire. It sat at the Silk Road crossroads. It was a hub of trade. It was relatively cosmopolitan, people doing business all over the place. The Ottoman Empire then was something of an integrated whole. You could travel quite easily to what was then Palestine or to Egypt or to Morocco. And already at that time, Jews from Aleppo were in Jerusalem setting up synagogues and yeshivas. And it's here that the Safras first emerge as financiers. This is a photo of several partners of Safra Frere, Safra brothers. They did business in French, among other languages. There were 4 brothers. They were not bankers, they were financiers. They would finance trade, camel caravans. If you were a farmer, you needed seeds. They would finance shepherds. They would trade gold and silver. They would trade currencies. And in the 1870s and 1880s, they sent one brother to Istanbul and one brother to Alexandria, 1870s. So they have it's like a mini Rothschilds, but of the Middle East, different branches in these different countries. They were, in addition, leaders of the. Okay. Of course, yep. In addition to being leaders in the financial community, they were leaders in the Jewish community. Aleppo had a very organized Jewish community centered around the Great Synagogue. There was a formal community council. There were organizations to clothe the poor, provide dowries to young women who were getting married. And the Safras were among the leading families. After World War I, as many of you know, the Middle East is carved up between England and France. France takes Syria and Lebanon. The British take Palestine, Egypt. The Ottoman Empire is no longer an integrated whole. It doesn't make sense to have a family business with branches in these different countries. Jacob Safra, whose father was Eli Safra, one of the Safra Frere. Eli Safra died when Jacob was quite young. His uncles take him under their wing, and they decide to send him to Beirut in 1920. Beirut's less than 200 miles from Aleppo, but a very different world. It was a cosmopolitan banking center. People spoke French. It had a vibrant nightlife. Oil money from the Gulf was coming in. It had casinos, had educational institutions, and this period of great coexistence between Jews, Druze, Maronites, Shiites, Catholic. This was all enshrined in their constitution in 1922. The one place where Jewish rights in the Middle East were actually affirmatively protected. And so in the 1920s, a lot of Jews from Aleppo and Damascus moved to Beirut. This is a photo of the Safra family. So that's Jacob Safra, Edmond's father. It's his mother, Esther Safra, who was Jacob Safra's first cousin. This was relatively common at the time. These are 6 of their children. Between 1922 and 1943, she had 10 children. In this photo, she's probably in her mid to late 30s. Between 1922 and 1943, 10 children. Edmond Safra is on the left here. He's probably 8 or 9 at that time. And so it's here where Edmond Safra is born into a world of networks. We're taught today about network effects and how important and powerful networks are. And no one had more powerful networks than Edmond Safra. He was born into several different networks. One was Jews from Aleppo. At the time, they were already dispersing. If you went to Manchester, England, Tokyo, the Philippines, South America, Colombia, you would find a handful, a few Jews from Aleppo doing business. Everybody knew each other. You could tell who somebody was by their name. You were probably related to them. Then there was the world of the Alliance. Who here knows anything about that? Did anybody here go to an Alliance school? Alliance.
Yeah, I did in my country, but not in I'm from Iran.
Yes.
Yeah, Alliance in Iran.
Alliance was a network of schools that was set up starting in the 1860s by Jewish philanthropists from France to educate Sephardic people. So from Morocco in the west to Iran and up into the Balkans, in major cities, you would find Alliance schools. They taught secular subjects, but also Jewish subjects as well. They had a training school in Paris where they would bring people from all over to be trained. It was like a big fraternity. And he was born into the network of Jewish bankers. His uncles and father were doing business with the Rothschilds, with the Mokadas, with other Jewish families in London and in Europe. The Jews were very much part of the establishment in Beirut. This photo is from the 1950s. In the middle is the man, Ben-Zion Lichtman, who was the chief rabbi of Beirut. To his left, with the tarbush, is Jacob Safra. And this man here is Pierre Gemayel of the Maronite Phalange, who I think later became president. Peter Gemayel. Very prominent politician. They were accepted as part of the establishment. But in 1947, things start to change in the Middle East. Jacob Safra is thinking, I need to have a beachhead for my family and for our business outside of Beirut. And so he sends his second son. He had an older son, Eli. He sends his second son, Edmond, to Milan at the age of 15. Now, he doesn't send him alone. He sent him with a chaperone, a 19-year-old guy named Jacques Towel. He said, you go to Milan, I'll set up accounts for you. There are a couple dozen Jews from Aleppo there. And you're going to start trading, looking for gold to buy. So he moves there. He always looked much older than he was. In this picture, he's probably 17 or 18. And so what did he do? He starts going to Zurich, to Amsterdam, to Paris, to buy gold. At the time in Europe, gold was not freely traded. The price of gold was $35 an ounce everywhere. In India and Hong Kong, gold traded freely. If you could move it there, you could sell it into the local market. So he asks his brother-in-law, who had been a surgeon in Aleppo, whose clinic was destroyed in the riots in 1947, and said, you go to Hong Kong, I will buy gold here, I will ship it to you, and you will sell it into the local market. So that's primarily what he was doing. He was doing other types of financing. He was getting involved in producing films, including one for Errol Flynn, who was trying to make a comeback. Again, this is in Italian, and it's a film based on an opera that he had been financing. He didn't do so well in the film business. So he was circulating around Europe, making a lot of money. But things in Beirut are starting to get worse. The family's apartment is ransacked. His father is thinking they need to leave on a more permanent basis. Now, Milan would have been a perfect home. It was a center of industry and finance, but you couldn't just move from Beirut or Syria to Europe in the early 1950s and hope to become a citizen. And you couldn't just move to the United States either, where there was a big Syrian community. They weren't taking people. So he decides he's going to move the family to Brazil. This is 1953, 1954. A closed economy, but one that is growing. And it was hospitable to Nazis, and it was hospitable to Jews who wanted to move. So 1954, this is his Brazilian passport. He moves his father, his brothers, his sisters to Rio and then to Sao Paulo. Because they're not citizens, they can't own a bank. So instantly he sets up several trading operations. He's trading coffee, soybeans, bartering for goods from behind the Iron Curtain, doing some local trade finance. But he doesn't stay in Brazil for long. He's traveling back to Beirut, where the family has their bank, and to Geneva, where he is setting up shop. In Geneva in 1959, he opens up Trade Development Bank, or TDB, which is a classic Swiss bank, private banking. And really, it was there to house and be a safe haven for people who were fleeing Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Morocco, Jews mostly. His vision was that he was there, of course, to make money, but to protect people's assets. So he sets that up in 1959. So now he's got Switzerland, Brazil, Beirut. 1963, he comes to New York. He says, I'd like to open up a bank here. This is called the Knox Building. It is, if any of you know where the New York Public Library is, KNOX. On 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, right in the middle of the action. I have the document. He bought this building for $3 million in 1963. You know, some people, like, they live on top of the store. This was his store, and he lived in the penthouse apartment on the top. And here he starts Republic Bank. And this is a classic American consumer bank. And he was so thrilled when the senator from New York, Robert Kennedy, came to the opening and the ribbon cutting. Edmond Safra is this guy right here. And that's his younger brother, Joseph. This was a classic. It sought to take deposits from middle class, again, mostly Jewish customers from Brooklyn and Queens and New York. But instead of making mortgages or credit cards, he would take this money and put it to work in his global network, lending to central banks, lending to loans guaranteed by the Export-Import Bank, investing in currencies, financing trade. But he had an intuitive sense for how business was done in America. And again, I've been in rooms where everybody knows what I'm about to show them. Republic became known as the television bank. He was trying to get deposits. At the time, you couldn't really compete by offering a higher interest rate. And by the way, these interest rates, you could get 7.6% for a year, which is not bad. And you could only give someone like a premium worth $10 if they open an account, like a toaster. But his insight was that if, like, Bernard came in to open an account, I could only give him something worth 10. But if he brought his friend, and the friend open an account with a CD, there was no limit. So he decided that they were going to give televisions to people who referred people who would bring in CDs, lock it up for 5 years. And the euro dollar at the time was giving 13% interest rate, so he could put that money to work profitably. And so you can imagine there were people lined up around the block. There was a woman named Ida Schwartz who referred 25 people and had 25 televisions. So Republic became known as the television bank. And that really sort of supercharged its growth. He was always looking for the bigger stage. In the 1960s, one of his nephews said, you know, I'm thinking about staying in Brazil, or maybe you should go to New York. And he said, you can stay in Brazil, or, you know, do you want to come to New York and meet David Rockefeller? And here's Edmond with David Rockefeller, and you can see David Rockefeller has his name tag, which is very helpful. So by the late 1960s, he has built this global family of banks. This is from the annual report. Now, they all weren't owned by the same person. So in the top corner, Safra SA, that's his brother's operation in Brazil. His father's bank in Lebanon. and then offices in Geneva, London. And you can see on this map, the dots are sort of filling in all these different places where he has operations in Europe, the Middle East, New York, South America. Part of the point of showing this is to show that he lived in several worlds at once. He was always moving in between these different poles in his life. But he had a very specific view of how banking was done. And it was these lessons he had learned from his father and his uncles in Aleppo and Beirut. One had to do with the idea of personal responsibility. He operated in places that had no such thing as deposit insurance. And there were no bailouts, certainly not for a Jewish banker. He had a saying that I would lose everything before anybody else lost a penny. He owned 30% of the stock of the equity in his banks. So he felt he was the first to get wiped out if something bad happened. He also didn't really like to lend money, and certainly not to people he didn't know. He had an upside down view of how banking worked. He thought the first job was to protect the depositors. And I feel like in 2023, we have to say this again. The first job of the banker is to protect the depositors. You lent money on a handshake, paying it back was a matter of family honor. And people never understood how his banks made so much money because he didn't do the classic lending that they did. He did trade finance, he did gold, he did the moving of banknotes, so the physical moving of banknotes around the world, which is a vital service. You get a small fee for it, but if you don't lose the money, there's no way you can lose money on it. He liked to make loans that were guaranteed by the Export-Import Bank or the World Bank, even though they paid a lower interest rate, he was sure they were going to get paid back. In 1972, his Swiss bank was taken public in London. Before the bank, he was lining up the underwriters and he said, keep the Ashkenazim away from me, they'll kill me. And you can see the lead underwriter is Rothschild. So he didn't fully keep them away. This was the biggest post-war public offering in London to date. It only raised about $20 million. And at the press conference announcing it, Jacob Rothschild, who I did a Zoom with a few months ago, he stood up and said, Edmond, I've known you for many years. My father knew your father. My grandparents knew your grandparents. And here we are doing business again today. Whoops. Oh, But so he was working at the highest level of global finance, but he had a very personal sense. He had thousands of customers, but he knew many of them personally. And I can't tell you the times I've given talks where somebody came up to me afterwards and said, he gave us a loan, he gave us a job. He had this personal interest in how people were doing. He didn't really have his own family in the 60s and 70s. So on Sunday, he would call people and say, how is this client doing? What's he up to? And they would say, it's the weekend. They're not doing anything. But he was very interested. I have a line in the book where I say that people like Edmond Safra, Syrian Jews generally, they acculturate, but they don't assimilate. He clung very tightly to rituals of Judaism and to the sense of community and responsibility that it engendered. And this is a picture of him wearing tefillin, which he put on every morning. I met his personal assistant. She said that when he walked in, that was the first thing he asked for. And if you understand the world he came from, there's no contradiction between being a faithful and observant Jew and living fully in the modern world. His view of how you did banking and how you treated people was informed by his Judaism and his sense of responsibility and a community leader. The Safras had been leaders of their communities in Aleppo and Beirut, and as they were exploding in the 1950s and 1960s, he took it upon himself to be one of the leaders in the diaspora. His sense of giving back, which is almost impossible to document fully because there were so many examples, was directly connected to his success in business. He used to say, Aleph Emunah, Beit Bracha. Who can translate that for me? Aleph Emunah.
Faith and blessing.
First faith, then blessing. Thank you. Now, The one place when I showed you that map where all his business operations were, there's one place that was missing, and that was Israel. Israel in the 1940s, 1950s was a poor socialist country, not a place to do much banking business. But as important, he felt it would be bad for the Jewish communities of Aleppo and Beirut that he was supporting, for his bank in Beirut, which was a vital institution for the Jews who were remaining in Beirut. That something bad would happen to them if he publicly identified with Israel. There were also boycotts and blacklists. He had a lot of clients in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, etc. This is a letter. I don't know if any of you have heard of the name Isaac Shalom. He was sort of one of the leaders of the Syrian Jewish community in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's a letter from, okay. It's a letter from one of Edmond Safra's aides to Isaac Shalom, who was a leader of the Syrian Jewish community. And he's writing him about sending money to Porat Yosef, which is a big yeshiva in the old city of Jerusalem. This is how he supported groups in Israel, through third parties, because he didn't want to be publicly identified. In 1975, Edmond Safra's rabbi from Beirut, Rabbi Atiyah, leaves finally and goes to Bat Yam, south of Tel Aviv. And I have the correspondence that shows Edmond basically funding this entire synagogue that he was building. And he came to Israel for the first time under an assumed name for the dedication of that. He was wary of being identified publicly with Israel, but he was a huge supporter of synagogues. It's a photo of him signing the finishing of a Torah. Anywhere, I guess maybe not here, but anywhere Sephardic Jews were gathering, in Brazil, a group of Egyptians in Brooklyn, in Spain, they would come to Edmond Safra and he would either be the lead donor or said, I'll pay for it. In 1974, when they were building the first synagogue in Spain since the Inquisition, they went to Edmond Safra, he donated it and named it after his father, Jacob, so it's Beit Yaakov. And you look around the world in Sephardic communities, you will find Kol Yaakov, Beit Yaakov, always after his father, never after himself. Philanthropy wasn't just about giving money. In many instances, it was about direct intervention in people's lives. To be a Jew in the 20th century was to know displacement, whether you were in Europe in the 1930s or the Middle East in the 1950s. Before I get to that, this is a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe from 1971. The occasion was that Edmond Safra had given, if any of you know Shaarei Zion, it's one of the big Syrian synagogues in Brooklyn, and he had given not one, but 2 Torahs. And so it's a whole drash on how it's a special mitzvah to give 2 Torahs, and it's signed by the Lubavitcher Rebbe and personally edited by him. This is a letter I found from 1979. I know some of you speak French and read French. It's from Le Rabbin de Aleppo, the rabbis of Aleppo. The community was still hanging on in the 1970s. And it's a letter signed by 8 or 9 rabbis who were there. And the subject is our dear benefactor of great heart and generosity. We're writing to you because the chief rabbi, a man named Yom Tov Yedid, was suffering. He had financial setbacks, medical setbacks. Could he please help? And see at the top, it's written $7,500. I'd assumed that was his handwriting. But at one of my events, a woman came up to me afterwards and said, I was Edmond Safra's assistant for 15 years. That's my handwriting. And part of every day was going through letters like this and writing down the amounts of donations. His masterstroke was in 1994, there were 4,000 Jews left in Syria. 94. There was a small opening after the Gulf War. and Western countries were putting pressure on Assad to let the remaining Jews go. And Assad said, well, I don't want to give people the impression that you can just leave Syria. So they can go, but they all have to buy round-trip plane tickets because they're coming back. And somebody called Edmond Safra and said, we need 4,000 round-trip plane tickets from Syria to the US. And on the spot, he gave them the money. And that was pretty much the end of the Jewish presence in Aleppo and Damascus. One of the big themes of his life was being a champion for Sephardic Jews in Israel, in the communities where they were, and in the diaspora. He did it on an individual basis, and he did it on an institutional basis. So in the late 1970s, Harvard comes to him and says, we'd like you to make a donation. He said, okay, I want to create a chair, not just in Jewish history, but in Sephardic Jewish history. We'll name it after my father, and it was the first endowed chair in Sephardic history in this country. There was a synagogue in Rhodes where the community had been decimated in the Holocaust. And I found a letter that every year he would send $500 so they could have a chazan come and do the high holidays. I don't know if any of you have heard of ISEF, the Israel Sephardic Education Foundation. So in 1977, Jews Sephardic Jews in Israel were often sent to development towns, not given opportunities. Only a very small percentage went to college. And he knew that they had as much ability and intellect as anybody else. He spoke 8 languages. One of his colleagues was complaining about this, and he said, well, let's do something about it. And they started this foundation, the Israel Sephardic Education Foundation, to give scholarships to people of Sephardic background in Israel. That was started in 1977. So he had a great deal of success in business. I like this photo because it shows his blending of the old world and the new world. In the foreground is that building that he bought where he lived, where he opened Republic. And then he acquired the properties that wrapped around it and built this headquarters in the 80s for Republic Bank. And they're still here today. It's the HSBC Tower. He had a remarkably successful career. HSBC. In the 80s, he acquired a villa in the south of France called La Leopolda that had been built by the King of Belgium of the same name. And he renovated it and decorated it. And to celebrate it, they had 2 parties, 400 people each. One was for his clients, like big shots, Elton John, people like that, designers, socialites. And the other was for all his friends from Beirut and Syrian Jews. And it was about this time that articles started to appear in the newspaper in Peru, in France, saying that Edmond Safra was a drug dealer, that he was involved with Iran-Contra. And this was this crazy that it's even 30 years later that this happened. Essentially, he had sold one of his banks to American Express in 1982 for $500 million. He became American Express's largest shareholder. They had a falling out. Edmond Safra in his own companies was a king. Here he was now regarded as a division head. And by the way, he still had other banks that he was running. So he sells his shares, and they knew that he was going to open a new private bank in Switzerland in 1988. And they figured all his clients, all his Jewish clients, would just come to him when he reopened. He had a 5-year non-compete. American Express tried to stop him in court. And when the Swiss ruled against them, a rogue PR officer started planting these stories. And it took him a year to unravel this, involving private investigators, mob informers, et cetera, that American Express was behind all this. And when he confronted them with the evidence, and they were scared that he was going to sue. He said, you just issue an apology and you give $8 million to this Jewish organization, this Christian organization, this hospital, and we'll be done with it. In 1999, at the age of 67, he sold his banks. He sold them for $10.3 billion to HSBC. He owned 30%, so that's $3 billion, which in 1999 was real money. You could like maybe get a house around here for that. And it would seem like it was a sort of storybook ending. But like the story of his life and of his community, there is an element of triumph, but also of tragedy, of success, but also displacement, of satisfaction and disappointment. Because in the 1990s, a series of tragedies. So the first was these attacks from American Express. And for someone whose name was on the bank, and for the name was not just himself, but his brothers, his cousins, the family honor, tarnishing the family name was literally the worst thing you could do. And it took a big toll on him. Second, while still in his early 60s, he was stricken with Parkinson's disease, which is a degenerative disease. The treatments then were not particularly good. So he was kind of physically unable to be able to manage this global empire he had built. And third, he married later in life. He didn't believe, typical Syrian guy, when he's 30, marries, well, back in the day, might have been a 15-year-old. In the 50s and 60s, it was an 18 or 19-year-old. And he didn't think it was right for him to have a family when he was traveling around so much. I think he enjoyed being single as well. So he got married in 1976 in his 40s to Lily. She had her own children from a prior marriage. So he didn't have his own children. And in his world, even though his banks were publicly held, every business was a family business. It was for your children, and in his world, your sons to take on, just as he had taken it on from his father. So he didn't have anybody who could be an heir to him. He didn't regard the professional managers as people who could be the CEO. He thought his bank was going to last for 100 years. In 1997, Republic actually sold 100-year bonds. He gave no thought to the idea that it wouldn't continue. This was an intergenerational trust. And so his plan was kind of that his brothers might take it over. But his brother Joseph had his own very large bank in Brazil that he had been building up. And they couldn't figure out a succession plan or a way to make it work. And so he was sick, so he decided to sell the banks. And if you'll note, the price was $72 a share. What significance might 72 have? How many times high? 4 times high. I don't know if that was part of it, but it very well would have, because there were other deals that he did where he waited. They had the deal done Monday and he said, no, I'm not going to sign the paper till Tuesday, the 18th, because he wanted it to be on the 18th of the month. So this should have been like storybook American success story. Immigrant comes here, starts a business, builds it up, sells it for a record price, walks away with $3 billion. But for him, it was a moment of sadness. When a friend came from Geneva to congratulate him, she said, Mabruk, congratulations, what an achievement. And he looked at her and he said, J'ai vendu mes enfants. Right, who can tell me, where are my French speakers? J'ai vendu mes enfants. I sold my children. I sold my babies. He was sad about it. But he was tireless. Even though he was sick, and in 67, he was going to start another financial institution, and this one would bear his name. He had a deal with the bank to say, I'll take my own money, and I'll take other clients up to $5 billion to manage. And he was finally going to create this new business, and he filed the papers in December 1999, and the next day, he died in a fire that was set by a member of his household staff. That was the end of Edmond Safra's life, the end of his business career, the end of his banks. When you look back on the life of someone who has had this kind of success in the world, the natural question is, what was his legacy? On the business side, actually, there really wasn't much of a legacy. He sold his banks. And yes, I've encountered people who worked for him who said they took on his lessons to apply it to how they did business. But in the world of finance, 25 years may as well be a century. So there's no operating business he left behind. The type of finance and banking he did, very different. When he died, he left most of his assets to his foundation. It's a professionally managed foundation based in Geneva that focuses on 3 areas: medical research, especially Parkinson's, education, and Jewish life around the world. This is a photo, if any of you know Parat Yosef. It's the big Sephardic yeshiva in the old city overlooking the Western Wall. And if you go by there today, it says Sha'ar Edmond Safra, so it's gate. And you look on the other side of the building, it's the Beit Midrash Yaakov Safra. So they have a sort of Safra takeover of that. This is just one of many institutions around the world that he has funded. And again, in his lifetime, there was nothing named after him. You go around the world today, in Brooklyn, the Sephardic Center is the Edmond Safra Center. There's the Edmond Safra Synagogue in Manhattan, in Florida. There are 24 Edmond Safra synagogues in Israel. If you go to the NIH, there's an Edmond Safra Lodge. There are professorships at NYU, at Wharton, NYU, NIH. There is a lodge, family lodge, yep. There's a Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, professorships at the University of Pennsylvania, rooms at Carnegie Hall. I've had this experience where friends who had never heard of him, and now as they're going around New York or the world, they're noticing his name on everything and they're texting me, did you know about this? Did you know about this? If you open your eyes, you will see Edmond Safra's name everywhere. So that is a very big part of his legacy. It continues to this day. And there's another part. When I was in Israel last November, I was giving talks in Jerusalem, at the Israel Museum, in the Edmond and Lilke. It was either a Mincha or Ma'ariv service broke out. There are a lot of rabbis who had received his donations from this organization. One day I was invited to give a talk at Tel Aviv University. And I had mentioned before the ISEF, the Israel Sephardic Education Foundation. Edmond Safra's foundation funds about 40% of that organization's budget. They support 150 to 200 people a year. And they come to meet in Tel Aviv University once a month. So I went and spoke to them. It has expanded its mission. It is there to support Sephardic kids whose parents came from Ethiopia, Druze, Arabs, people from every underrepresented walk of life in Israel. And when you look at this group of people in all their diversity, this is a picture of what modern Israel looks like. And these are kids who are first generation students. I talked to them, they are studying to be doctors, biologists, political science, you name it. And I think it's really like in the lives of the people that he continues to touch, his philanthropy continues to touch, the buildings and the institutions that he created, that you really find his true legacy. And with that, I will end, and I will be happy to take questions. And as typically, I would say at almost every event, there's been someone who stood up and has told either a story or an anecdote relating to his life that I did not know about. So, thank you. Yes. What's that?
How did his family receive the book? Were they happy it came
Yeah.
out? Were they-
So I met and interviewed his wife several times. She read it. She made comments. She corrected some facts. she died just before, I mean, she died before it was formally published, but she saw the final copy. I have met, as I said, he didn't have his own children, but I have met several of his nieces and nephews and cousins at various events, and they all seem to be quite pleased by it. There's his younger brother became a very big banker in Brazil. He died in 2020, just a couple of years ago. His name was Joseph, or Juju. He had another brother, Moise, who was also in Brazil, who ran the family's industrial operations down there. They were all extremely successful in their own right. When Joseph Safra died, all the obituaries said he was the richest banker in the world, probably worth about 20 billion. So I know that those people in that branch of the family have read it as well. So pretty good response so far. Yes.
I happen to work at NIH, and I happen to meet the contracting officer who did the Safra Family Lodge. He said that Mrs. Safra was very, very picky, conscientious, and picked everything for the lodge. And if you've ever been there, it's beautiful. So,
And tell me what is the lodge for?
okay, so everybody here knows the Children's Inn, which is for children who've been treated in NIH. The Family Lodge is similar, but it's for adults. It's for adults being treated at NIH, and they can stay there free. And it's a beautiful, I think it's like Adirondack style. It's a lodge, it's beautiful, beautiful furniture, and they can stay, the families can stay there free. And we used to, my group used to offer like dinners for people who were there. And there were so many different people. There were Amish people, there were people from all over the world who came. I met one guy, and he said when he was a child, he was adopted, and everybody thought he would die. And every time he got older, they thought he was going to die. And now he's about 40. He said, if I knew I had lived this long, I would have taken better care of him. But it was a beautiful place.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to share something that was related to Safra. 1997, we were in the old building, not in this building. There was an old couple, Mr. Harari from Vatican. He and his wife asked me, who are you? I'm Mr. Harari from Israel. Tomorrow we have a big event of Safra in the National Museum. Okay. 2 days later, I received flowers and beautiful tie. I forgot about it. A year later, on Sukkot, Mr. Harari sits there. That's my chair. Mr. Harari, what are you doing here? Tomorrow we have an event. Safra. It was Bongo, and they rented the place. 4,000 people. My wife was the World Bank. So Sukkot, Mr. Harari says, Mr. Tawil from Jack Tawil from London, and let's say in March. I told them, I want you to have lunch in my sukkah. So like a soda, I bring them home. My wife was not there, she was talking. I had the housekeeper. Mr. Imar, I don't have food with it. I don't care. Make a salad, open tuna, but beautiful time in the sukkah. Mr. Tawil said, Mr. Imar, I want you to come to the event tomorrow with your wife, Steve, and my son. We went to the event. 4,000 people shared from the hall. Walls with flowers, and the food was, it was not a kosher caterer, but there was no meat. It was meat, you know, pastries, and then Moise. I didn't speak Arabic, not their Arabic, I didn't understand it. So Mr. Tawil says that Mr. Imar invited us in his practice.
So
That was like,
thank you for that. So what he's,
in 64, his father, they used to go to the Riyadh with money, they didn't know anything.
starting in the 70s, the IMF and the World Bank have their annual meetings, and I think every other year it was in Washington. So for the Safras, who, again, They did business with the central banks of Singapore, Philippines, South Africa, et cetera. They would take over, they would have a huge reception, usually at one of the Smithsonian or one of the big art museums. They would take over the whole thing. They would invite 4,000 people, senators, central bankers, clients, and the Safra brothers would stand there like in a receiving line and receive everybody. And this was like a big part of the kind of culture of how they did business. Yes, sir.
Is there a rough estimate of how much is in the foundation? And even more so, how much he gave away both in his life and now with the foundation?
Well, it's Switzerland, so they don't have the same kind of disclosures that we have, so you couldn't go and find. I think when he died, he had, 3 billion alone. Forget about his real estate and art. And I think left about half of it to the foundation then. But his giving that he was doing on a personal basis over his lifetime, there were these, I wouldn't say there was like a single ledger, but you would find these folders that would say Kala. Someone was getting married, you would send them $100, but hundreds of them. And same with like synagogues. So it's very hard. It wasn't, professionalized during his lifetime. He had people who worked for him whose job it was to deal with people who were asking for money. And I don't know, do you guys auction aliyot here? Yeah. Okay. I was, when I say this in Ashkenazi synagogues, people are always shocked because they don't understand how it works. But he would, at Kol Nidre, he would send somebody basically to every synagogue in Brooklyn and buy up all the honors for his family, but as a way of basically providing liquidity to the sort of Jewish synagogue sector. And again, there's a guy in my synagogue who was telling me, he said, he used to go to there was a Moroccan minyan on the Upper East Side, like in the Roxbury Hotel or somewhere in Madison Avenue that he used to go to. And that he would come in, people $100, 180 for an aliyah. And then one morning he's there and they said, aliyah, someone goes, 10,000. And it was, and he looks at him and, he didn't know it, but it was inside. Like that's what he sort of did on a routine basis. What, way in the back. Yes, they issued a letter from the CEO saying, we acknowledge that these things were untrue. And they put it out like on a Friday at 6 o'clock, hoping nobody would notice. In it was like heavily lawyered, right? Because their liability would have been pretty immense. And he kind of let them off the hook. Yes, sir.
I actually had the fortune of meeting with him.
Okay.
In Monaco. We used to manage a portion of his assets out in Geneva through the Almale family. This is when it was Republic Bank before it became HSBC and all of those.
Yeah, so like Sam Almale?
And his son really was running it at that time, Roberto Almale.
Yep.
And I actually went to his penthouse in Monaco, which was right next to Observatory before he died. So in my little bit of interaction with him, he was an absolute standout person.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. See, there are always people who have some interaction. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. It's been great. I read something recently, but I only saw words of it, so I don't know much about it. Is there a lawsuit or a fight from one of Nikki's? What was his wife's name?
His wife is named Lily, but I think you're referring to something else. That's his brother. That's his brother's family. So his brother Joseph, who had his own Banco Safra in Brazil, which is like the 6th largest retail bank in Brazil, and he has a big private banking operation in Switzerland. So Joseph Safra, all privately held. So the family owns it, and he died in 2020. And there's been some disagreement among his children vis-a-vis each other, but this has nothing to do with Edmond Safra.
Can you talk a little bit more about his death? I know he seemed to be A lot of
Yeah.
history about what that was. all
Well, I could tell you
about.
just go read chapter 16, but I will tell you a little. So, like I said, he lived in this amazing penthouse apartment. I think it was 2 stories in Monaco. He had very heavy security. So in Villa Leopolda, he always had 12 Israeli, probably 4 ex-Mossad, ex-IDF security guards. He was very security conscious. If you're a wealthy person in Brazil, you know, from kidnapping and things like that. They had set up the Monaco apartment with security, you know, in the building, electric shutters, so there could be, I want to say like hermetically sealed almost, so that they didn't need to have security in there when he was there. He had a staff of nurses, like 5 or 6. One of them was an American who had been in the army, suffering from PTSD, was a little off. And he was insecure about his place in the household. The other nurses made fun of him, whatever. And the story is that he decided that he would stage an attack on the apartment and fend it off, and thus be the hero, and this for his position would be secured. So he gets up in the morning at 4. He sandpapers his face. He stabs himself with a knife. He yells, "There are intruders." He wakes up Edmond Safra and gets one of his other nurses to kind of, he couldn't move that well, to maneuver him into this dressing room. Said, "There are intruders, stay here." And he sets a fire in a waste paper basket where they had medical supplies to alert the first responders, set off smoke alarms. And there was like rubbing alcohol in it, starts a fire. He goes downstairs, says, "I've been attacked, they're intruders," they call the police. And I don't want to say a comedy of errors, but a series of errors ensues. In Monaco, they don't really have violent crime. They have financial crime, but not violent crime. So they don't know really what to do. They can't operate the security system. His Israeli security guards come screaming down from the house in the hills in 20 minutes, and they arrest the guy. They put him in handcuffs. They think he's an intruder. His wife is evacuated. Everyone else is evacuated. He's now locked in this dressing room with one of his nurses. They establish that there's nobody else in the building, and they're calling him and telling him it's safe to come out, but he won't come out. Meanwhile, this fire started, and it's being circulated throughout the house by the HVAC equipment, and they can't figure out how to open the shutters are electrically closed. Firemen can't open it, and basically after a couple of hours, he dies of asphyxiation along with his nurse in the dressing room. The guy confessed 2 days later. He went on trial. He had a defense. He was convicted. He had an appeal. He was convicted. He served a sentence. A lot of conspiracy theories, people making things up. But I lay it out in there. It's all based on the testimony given in court, rulings of the court, testimony from the police, etc.
Last question, any plans for a screenplay?
No. Hollywood's on strike, so. Okay.
Here the archives and are they open access?
They are not open access. They are, I guess, mostly in Geneva, but what they did, they digitized everything and they sent me a thumb drive. So I would be sitting in Connecticut on my computer in the middle of COVID and having all this material at my disposal.
So nobody can access.
No, you can't go there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have a question. On Ed's wife, did she have any children?
Edmond Safra's wife, did she have children? Yeah, she had. Yes, she had been married. She had 3 of her own, and she got married very young, like as a teenager, to a guy named Cohen in Brazil, and they had 3 children named His name in Brazil was Monteverde. Monteverde means green mountain. In Yiddish, that would be Grunberg. So it's Freddie Grunberg from Romania who built it's called Ponto Frio. It's like the biggest kind of white goods and appliance chain in Brazil. He had that, so they were married. This guy Freddie had a child from his first marriage that she essentially adopted. He died in 1969. And so then she married Edmond Safra in 1976. By that time, she was in her 40s. So she had children, but they were from prior marriage. And were not involved in the business.
Okay, everyone, thank you.
Thank you.